Okay, so the subject of this video is going to be Chilcot Inquiry, the Iraq War, and Tony Blair, specifically those three subjects. Just a disclaimer, this will be a longer video, and I think there's no other way. I can't really condense a subject like this into 5 or even 10 minutes. Inevitably, it has to be a longer video because there's a lot of angles to look at. Just as indication of that, the Chilcot Inquiry amounted to 2.5 million words, approximately 5 times longer than War and Peace. Obviously, I'm not going to be talking about all the details, but I do want to lay this out. I think it's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it concerns the reputation of this country. Secondly, it concerns the reputation of one of our most influential and important prime ministers ever. And thirdly, it concerns lessons perhaps for the future and for history. Um, so, just to give a little bit of background, the Chilcot Inquiry is named after Sir John Chilcot, who's a civil servant. In the UK, obviously being a parliamentary democracy, when there is high profile inquiries into important issues concerning the misdoings or supposed misdoings of public individuals, it has to be a third party, usually judges or civil servants, that chair these sort of inquiries. Some other prominent examples are the Levison inquiry over phone hacking at News Corp, and the inquiry into high profile sex abuse scandals around the BBC, individuals like Jimmy Savile. Forget what the formal name for that inquiry was. But Chilcot is named after Sir John Chilcot, and it was announced by the Brown administration some 7 years ago. So this has been a long, drawn-out process. Little bit of history. It's necessary to give a very basic recap of what happened in 2003. After months, numerous months of a gradual countdown to war, in the time after 9/11. Certainly, George Bush had, at a very early stage, tried to link Iraq to 9/11. As history shows, it had virtually no connection to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. But gradually, Iraq got more and more and more into the equation. There's no question that Western leaders collectively had long resented Saddam Hussein and his tyranny in Iraq and the region. Of that fact, no one can dispute. And let's just make this very clear. Saddam Hussein was one of the most brutal dictators of modern times. No one can rationally argue otherwise. This is a man who committed genocide against his own people, who was guilty of some of the most heinous human rights abuses of any regime in modern history, who invaded Kuwait, who started the Iran-Iraq war, who routinely flouted UN sanctions, and who, in my opinion, was responsible for the enormous amount of increased child mortality deaths in Iraq in the period of UN sanctions. The UN's frequently blamed for that. I believe it rests solely with Saddam for flouting regulation after regulation, resolution after resolution. So both George Bush and Tony Blair had long had Iraq on the radar. I think there's no question about that. What they needed was an excuse to go to war. And gradually over time, they realized that their sort of smoking gun, so to speak, was weapons of mass destruction. I think had they just looked at the human rights factor, it wouldn't have been enough to justify going to war. In their mind, I'm talking about, because people would turn around and say, well, there's plenty of other despotic regimes around the world. So they really rested on that case. Obviously, the coalition leader was George W. Bush, and his reputation will eternally be connected with Iraq. But in Britain, the situation is, I wouldn't say necessarily more complex, but within America, there have been historic presidents. There have been Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. with Vietnam. So with Iraq, it was the Vietnam syndrome, I think, on the American side. In Britain, I wouldn't say it's on parallel. We've certainly had prime ministers who brought this country into war on many occasions before. I mean, Viscount Palmerston was very much a 19th century Tony Blair. But the angle that Blair took, firstly, he was caricatured routinely in the UK as being a lapdog of George Bush rather than a partner. Um, and this was a reputation that really, really clung to him as it became quite obvious that he was not going to back down and these two men were going to work together to the bitter end. So Tony Blair, rather than being seen as a partner of George Bush, was seen. I mean, in British circles, there was a lot of question marks about this because both men came from different backgrounds, very different backgrounds. One was kind of guy next door, swaggering Texan from a right wing Republican Party. The other, came from a Labour social democratic background. Okay, he modernised the Labour Party. He definitely brought it to the centre. Some would say to the right. But the fact remains that they came from very different backgrounds. Of course, Tony Blair had been working with Bill Clinton for 2 or 3 years before this. They had a very strong working relationship. So initially, you know, they would have had questions as to how to work together. But over time, they became very, very close allies. And, history writes that we always talk about Bush and Blair almost in the same sentence. Certainly in Britain, that's the way it is viewed. Of all of the international allies that they got together, Tony Blair, I mean, that George Bush got together, there was John Howard in Australia, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, and several other leaders. I think altogether there was 33 coalition nations. But it really was Tony Blair that was the major partner, I think. Um, there is a lot of speculation that the US would have gone this alone. I think that's probably true. I think it's also true that to some extent, Bush wanted some sort of revenge for his father's perceived humiliation in the wake of the Gulf War. Initially, that had been a military success, but what happened afterwards was Saddam, massacred the Iraqis after Bush told them to rise up against him. The Middle East has been a very, very, very long cauldron for Western foreign policy, going way, way, way back to the Arab Revolt, the end of the First World War. And it's become especially prominent from the I was going to say the 80s onwards, I would say the 70s onwards. Um, Now, to what extent, firstly, I should say what the rulings of Chilcot are. This inquiry has cost millions. It's been a long time coming, and this is the findings. A lot of people thought this will be a whitewash, Tony Blair will be exonerated. Not so. This was the key findings, and this is just summarised from today's Times, London Times, showing a very solemn Tony Blair there. Britain invaded Iraq when peaceful options for disarmament still existed. Saddam Hussein posed no imminent threat, presumably that is to the NATO countries. Tony Blair overestimated his ability to influence George Bush. The circumstances in which Britain decided that invasion was legal were far from satisfactory. MI6 supplied flawed intelligence on Iraq's ability to use weapons of mass destruction. One of the things that came about was supposed uranium from Niger that MI6, believe it was MI6, was tied to that, and that was used by the coalition leaders as one of the main sort of pieces of evidence that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction. But that was a very, very vague claim. Planning for Iraq after the fall of Saddam was wholly inadequate. Now, that's an understatement. Britain undermined the UN Security Council where a majority opposed war. Of course, this was a very, very divisive foreign policy move, and it pitted traditional NATO allies against each other. France and Germany, especially France under Jacques Chirac, were very vocally opposed to this, and it really became quite a tense situation. I believe it was the most strained that Anglo-British relations had been since Suez. Um, in fact, before that, Russia naturally was also hostile to the West position, as was China. So this was something that really did divide world opinion. In the lead up to Iraq, the world saw the largest anti-war demonstrations in history, bar none. Even the Vietnam War hadn't seen demonstrations on that sort of scale. 1 million people in London, 2 million in Rome, thousands in Madrid, Paris, New York, Tokyo. So this really did have global repercussions. And there is a very strong weight to the view that this has soured the view of both Britain and America in the Middle East ever since. It could be argued America's reputation was already in a bad way because of previous foreign policy engagements. You know, when I think about this, first in my own position at the time, I opposed the war, but I was kind of an ideologically driven 17-year-old. I was frankly a bit naive. I kind of saw myself as being in like the 60s era with people, opposing the Vietnam War. And it was kind of this quasi romantic notion of being part of something. And the truth is, I didn't have I was motivated then by emotions. And the thing is, with something like Iraq, because it is such a bitterly divisive subject, I mean, it was in this country, it still is. I mean, I think Tony Blair's name in Britain is a lot more vilified than George Bush's name is in America. As for this inquiry, I don't know, it has to be emphasised this is very much a British focused inquiry on the role of the British government. This has little to do with the American government's role, which was, of course, central. It was, they were the leading power involved. But this inquiry, the Chilcot Inquiry, is very much to do with the British role. Tony Blair, incidentally, whilst he was emotional, he said he was sorry for the losses, but he would do it all again. And he has been robust in this for the last 13 years. I think no matter where he goes, no matter what he does, he will be tied with it. There's a few things I want to say. Like I said, at that time I was fiercely opposed to it. And I was, to be honest, quite radical, quite hard left at that time. Over the years, I've become a lot more centrist. Even, dare I say it, we'll put it this way, I have a very ambiguous view of Tony Blair. In the United Kingdom, there is sort of a tendency for Blair bashing, and sometimes I think that is unfortunate because basically what we've had ever since 2003, not only this man's reputation completely dragged through the mud, but basically Tony Blair is a byword for dirt. I mean, the man's name is absolutely vilified. And I think that's somewhat unfortunate because to have a fair assessment both of the man and of his historical decisions, people need to think objectively. And I think people tend to think emotionally when it comes to Tony Blair and Iraq. I would definitely never ever patronise someone who had lost a husband or a son or a brother in the Iraq War. To look at the human cost, 179 British servicemen were killed, over 4,500 American servicemen, numerous soldiers from other countries, and most striking of all, there was an enormous civilian toll. We will never know the true toll. It could be anywhere from 120,000, which is the Iraq body count figure, to 1.4 million, which is the opinion research business figure. The higher figure, even if it's an exaggeration, shows how costly this war was. I think the true figure is somewhere around the middle. But I do remember when things were really, really grim in Iraq, and they still are. 2006, 2007, car bombs every week. 50 people killed in Baghdad just became another day in Baghdad. Sadly, the situation today is little changed. Now, when I say that we need to think objectively, what I mentioned at the start, there is all the facts about Saddam being a brutal dictator, and they are facts. And it is a fact that he routinely flouted UN resolutions. Here's a question, and it's something that I've been pondering on for some time. If we look at what happened in Syria, 2010, 2011, the Syrians, as with other Arab Spring countries, rose up against Assad. They were frustrated with corruption, with brutality, and with unemployment. Assad used brute force, the war broke out, and the Islamists filled the vacuum. Now, what is to say that had Saddam stayed in power, something similar wouldn't have happened in Iraq, i.e., during the Arab Spring, what's to say Iraqis wouldn't have risen up? Certainly some did. But certainly with Saddam in power, it's conceivable, bearing in mind that he's from the same political faction as Bashar Assad, or at least similar. It's Ba'athist contingency. You know, what's to say the Iraqis wouldn't have risen up in 2011 and Iraq would just be like Syria today? I mean, Iraq is in a state of civil war, but what's to say that wouldn't have been the case with or without intervention in 2003? So I don't accept the argument that had there been no Western intervention, the Middle East would be the land of milk and honey. I just don't believe that. I think there is a lot of pre-existing problems, dictatorships that have been in existence long before George Bush and Tony Blair decided to invade. I think where the fatal flaw with their legacy lies is firstly invading a sovereign nation. There's no escaping that fact. That's what happened. Secondly, a sovereign nation that had not attacked Britain or America. Secondly, shock and awe caused a lot of civilian casualties that immediately turned the Iraqis against Britain and America. You know, if you see your entire family wiped out by an American or British bomb, you're not going to treat people as liberators. That's common sense. And thirdly, the appalling post war management. I mean, it seems there just was not enough consideration of what would fill the gap from Saddam Hussein afterwards. And what has happened is a vicious sectarian war that still hasn't been resolved. A few days ago, 258 people killed in Baghdad. So this grim story continues. You know, I want to be very cautious in appearing to be too defensive of Tony Blair because this man's decision, along with George Bush, unquestionably caused enormous suffering and turmoil in the region. There's no question about that. And fundamentally, there's no way to gloss over the fact that the NATO countries, at least Britain and America, invaded a sovereign nation. And this has damaged our reputation ever since. There's no way to gloss that over. But what I don't agree with is blaming all the deaths in Iraq and all the chaos in Iraq solely on Bush and Blair. My issue with that is if you blame everything on those coalition leaders, you mitigate responsibility from Saddam Hussein, you mitigate responsibility from the sectarian thugs that are hell bent on causing or on continuing this ethnic civil war. I should say sectarian driven civil war. You know, when they bomb holy sites in Najaf and Karbala, their intention is to stoke up sectarianism. Now, ISIS, of course, has come into the picture and it's become a renewed war against ISIS. I would never ever tell an Iraqi, oh, you should treat us as liberators and you should be thankful because their country is in ruins. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of civilian deaths in Iraq were not caused by the coalition, but were caused by various insurgent groups. This was irrefutable fact. It is an irrefutable fact. So summed up, I totally understand the criticism of Tony Blair. Incidentally, some of the key figures around him have also come under a lot of scrutiny. Jack Straw, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, and to a lesser extent Jeff Hoon, who was Defence Secretary at the time. In fact, Hoon argued that he had tried to increase, debate and discussion of the post-war settlement, but had been kept out of key meetings. Take from that what you will. France definitely exploited the situation and they presented themselves as pacifists, which was a lot of nonsense. France, for one thing, helped to fuel the Rwandan genocide by arming the genocidaries. So, you know, a lot of countries politicised it at the time to kind of bash Britain and America when said countries were far from innocent themselves. At the moment, the overwhelming consensus is damning Tony Blair. I mean, some of the press today really was quite brutal. I think the Daily Mail referred to him as a monster. Like I say, this was a deeply divisive conflict, and I would say there is rank hypocrisy on several fronts. Now, if people are going to vilify Tony Blair, they shouldn't forget the fact that at the time, a slight majority of the country supported the invasion at the exact time of war. Now, that may have been sentimental reasons because our boys were out there, and that tends to happen. People shouldn't incidentally confuse, respect for soldiers with support or otherwise of foreign policy. It's not the same thing. But it got very divisive. I remember there was people vowing to go out there as human shields. Um, and the eternal reputation since then is that Tony Blair lied to the British people. I haven't seen any evidence that he directly lied. I think he had conviction in what he believed, and he was going on the information he received from MI6 and from the White House. And take from that what you will, but to this day, Tony Blair has stood by his position on this. To be honest, 13 years on, the legacy is very, very damning, but 20, 30, 40 years, will there maybe be a different assessment? I don't know. I think it entirely depends what pans out in Iraq. I wouldn't say that the 179 soldiers died in vain. I think that's a little bit insulting, actually, to their sacrifice. It is interesting, though. The mother of one of the soldiers who died actually said that she was thinking from a mother's perspective. She herself acknowledged that her own son might think differently. I mean, if those 179 brave young men, some women as well, if they, you know, how would they see their death if there's such a thing as heaven? If they're looking down, would they see their death in vain, or would they, as Tony Blair put it, see it as being part of the defining geopolitical struggle of the 21st century? I'm reluctant to say that soldiers die in vain because I think it's slightly insulting to them, but also there is an uncomfortable fact that people need to acknowledge. Soldiers die in war. And I don't mean to sound like a cold bastard by saying that. I really, really don't. But soldiers die in war. And I think it is important to put things in context. 179 soldiers died over 8 years, 2003 to 2011. 19,240 soldiers died in one day at the Battle of the Somme. And I'm not trying to trivialize Iraq for a second. I'm just saying that war, this is what happens in war. And when someone signs up to the armed forces, they know that. So I'm not quite sure if I agree with those who say that Tony Blair killed the soldiers. The people who killed them were the people who killed them. Um, when someone joins the army, they know that the prime minister in office could send them to war. I think one of the problems was in not providing them with the right equipment, and there was a lot of scandals over that, which is a disgrace. Um, I'm going to round this up in the next, actually, a little bit painful. I've been looking into this camera for a while now. The truth, what I was going to say actually is there's hypocrisy. I meant to get back to that point. A lot of the tabloids are vilifying Tony Blair. The very same rags were trumpeting war back in 2003. So if Tony Blair is going to be vilified, they should be vilified as well. Because they helped, use the war drums to get us into this. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that there are some people who still believe this was the right decision and not just Tony Blair. I think it's wrong to say that had there been no invasion, Iraq would be some sort of utopia. Michael Moore, who I used to support, now I don't think he's a serious source of view because I think he's a caricature of himself, basically. But I remember he made it was one of his films, I don't know if it was Bowling for Columbine or Dude, Where's My Country, something like that. Forget the exact film, but there's this scene where he kind of shows pre-war Iraq, and he's showing like children on swings and people are smiling. It's presenting this image like Iraq was some sort of utopia. Now they didn't have bombings every week, and the security situation was obviously a lot better. But The idea that Iraq was some sort of happy place before the war is nonsense. I think most Iraqis, given the choice of living under Saddam or living in the current chaos, would probably choose Saddam. But that doesn't mean that they were happy. So, you know, this is something that really stirs up strong viewpoints. Ian McKellen wrote a novel called Saturday, which really highlights the feelings on Britain at that time. It focuses on a neurosurgeon. I haven't read the book yet, but it's got a lot of good reviews. And the neurosurgeon is kind of observing the big anti war protests, and he's divided on it. At the time, I personally was very, very much against it. But I think there were many people who were divided. They didn't know what to believe. Um, Tony Blair's name is forever going to be tied to this. And he knows that. I mean, this is a man who served this country for 10 years. In my opinion, he had some very profound achievements. But he will forever be tied to Iraq. Call me naive, but when I look and listen to Tony Blair, I don't think he's a liar. I think this is a man who was driven by conviction. That conviction may have been dead wrong, but my instinct is he didn't lie. And that's something that's kind of thrown around. It's as if it is an absolute fact. Now, Tony Blair may have wanted to go to war. That doesn't mean he lied. Anyway, I'm going to round this up because there's not really much more that can be said. I don't want to offend anyone with this video, but there has to be a balanced sort of reflection on this, and I think a lot of the assessments are basically just vilifying Tony Blair without looking at all the issues. I don't think that's entirely fair. Um, Tony Blair and George Bush have blood on their hands. There's no question about that. But to blame everything on Tony Blair and George W. Bush is, in my opinion, to exonerate the callous sectarian thugs that have done the bulk of the killing. There is also another danger with this, that because subsequent British Prime Ministers are very aware of this Iraq syndrome, there will be a great reluctance to act in the future against dictators. I mean, people will say, well, look at Libya, look at other examples, but the difference is they were not ground invasions. Now, that could be a problem if there is a dictator who really is threatening world peace. A potential future Prime Minister may be reluctant to act because they'll be looking at what's happened to Tony Blair. That could be unfortunate. So there's many, many things to be considered with this. Anyway, I'm really going to have to round this up because I've spoken at length. I may make another video about this, I don't know yet. If you're going to comment here, please keep it respectful. There's no need to throw insults or anything like that. I believe I've been respectful. If you disagree with me, that's fine. Summed up, I think this remains a huge foreign policy disaster. I think in retrospect that Saddam's brutality didn't warrant creating the situation that is very much in Iraq today. And I do think realistically a lot of the chaos in the Middle East can be traced back to this time. But I reject the idea that A, Iraq would be some sort of utopia without the invasion, and B, you could blame everything on Bush and Blair. I don't think that's fair. And I don't think it is an accurate reflection on the facts. And I do think it would be unfortunate if, when people think of the name Tony Blair, they only think of Iraq. This man has had enormous achievements, and I still believe he's one of our greatest prime ministers. As he said, who would have wanted to be in his shoes in 2003? Let me know your thoughts. Keep it respectful. Thank you.